Welcome to week 3, Fireside Chat. So yes, still the same shirt on, and the background hasn't changed. Somebody did tell me I look like Simon Cowell. Not sure I see it, but actually when I looked online at a couple pictures, maybe I see it a little bit. Strangely enough, I had an eBay auction in today for some baseball cards that I kept as a kid that I had just found in a box and didn't think that they were worth anything, and they sold for $91. So that was quite a surprise. They almost ended up in the garbage bin. So yes, good news all around. So welcome to week 3, and we're going to talk about start with the Sauk County Directors article. So that's an article I wrote a few years ago and was published in Advance magazine. So please go through it, but let me give you the background. I worked for the school district of Reedsburg as a special education director, and at that time a number of other new directors were starting in Baraboo, Spring Green, Wisconsin Dells, and we also partnered with Sauk Prairie. But what we had decided was to start meeting as a group and kind of talking about similar issues that we all face, like, how do you get IEP compliance, or, what do you do for adaptive FIAD, but then other discussions of how do we handle a bilingual eval. I mean, because we didn't really have a speech language therapist that also was Spanish speaking. Although I had one in my district, other districts didn't. And then also we talked about some very specific larger ticket physical therapy type equipment, where maybe a student leaves, or a student with a visual impairment, and then this piece of equipment is left behind. So now this was kind of an interesting situation because it did go a little bit outside of our CISA. So it was a strange relationship because in a way it was kind of creating a mini CISA within a CISA, and it wasn't intended to have anything negative towards CISA, but it was really intended for our smaller group to do a lot of collaborating, sharing of resources, professional development, and then also, for example, like my SLP that also spoke Spanish, a neighboring district, if in the partnership that we had, if they were able to borrow her for a couple days a year to do some evals, and then either I would receive services back from them. We never really did a cash exchange. It was always, okay, then do you have someone who's has assistive technology expertise that can come over and do some stuff with us, or some behavioral background, or whatever it was. We would kind of swap out and balance things. What was really neat about that is our district administrators were all on board, and typically the staff that were involved in that, it wasn't like we had we created a position then where a staff person was shared all over the place. It wasn't like that, but maybe that we could tap into different expertise at different times. But it did become also a really cool lending library for different pieces of equipment that we had. And then also if we had a specific training that we were doing in district, that we could offer that to the other districts. And we could be much more, if you're a CISA, you have to be responsive to, maybe 35 districts. And for us, we were all connected. We had borders, students going back and forth, and we could handle that, develop something that was very specific to us. So in doing that, it was extremely successful, and we only stayed together as a short time, and then we all moved into different positions in other districts. But it is something I definitely encourage you to consider as a pupil services director. It instantly increases the resources that are available to your students, and it does set up an opportunity too for some 6630 agreements. And what I mean by that is, let's say that you you have some students with severe behavior needs, and you create a program, to meet their needs, and a neighboring district has 2 or 3 students. Instead of, 2 programs be created, maybe 1 program is created, and then it's either housed in your district or their district, and you have an agreement where you pay so much, to participate in that. And I know CSIS have things like that too, but that's just one example. But yeah, we actually had a website, and we had access. We could go into a lending library, but having the group together was wonderful to look at data also, like what we were seeing for trend data for IEPs, where we see more learning disability, more speech language IEPs, and then if so, was there something we could look at from a curriculum standpoint that might, was there a curriculum flaw? Here was an example. We were noticing a lot of early childhood referrals coming in for occupational therapy. And what we did is, as a group, we talked and went back and with our districts and worked on helping our early childhood staff develop more fine motor practice activities. And then actually once that was incorporated, the referrals went down. We just realized, hey, we weren't working as much on fine motor, and that's why these referrals were coming in. So anytime you have a chance to partner, build those partnerships, I encourage you to do that, especially with professional development. It was kind of a handshake agreement, and it is something that, I wouldn't get real intense into, some written documents, and you're not going to have everybody on board if, you have turnover and superintendents have different views. So it's something to explore and see what you can make out of it. Again, the lending library was awesome for us because we could get assessments from other districts and maybe borrow them for 4 to 6 weeks and then get them back. And sometimes an assessment tool might cost you a few $1,000s, and again, if you didn't have to use it very often. But so yeah, please read that article, and I would look back at my career as a special education director and say that was one of the best things that I was involved in, not only from networking, but I think the benefit that we brought to students in both services and resources was incredible because of that consortium. We talk about a SWOT analysis during this week: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. Now, kind of the joke I use is SWAT's up, like instead of what's up, but so a SWOT. A SWOT is great to keep a department focused, or keep your counselors focused, your overall, special ed department. But let's look at this. So let's say you're looking at your special education department as a whole. So the strengths might be that you have, veteran staff. A weakness is you don't have common planning time. An opportunity is that, people can go to conferences. A threat is that, parents might choose to withdraw consent for placement, or, place their child at a different school if they don't agree with the services that you're providing. So you can help figure out your priorities as a department by looking at kind of a SWOT analysis. And you'll do this in this week, and then you'll use that SWOT analysis later when you get into your final non-discrim paper. But when you look at your opportunities, that's where you really want to maximize. So if an opportunity is, again, we talked about the Sauk County thing to share services, but maybe an opportunity is that you're going to look at the schedule, with the principals, and have schedule committee and maybe consider redoing schedules so you can get common planning time. So you can have regular education teachers and special education teachers teaching together, and you know, introduce that and looping and all of these things. Now you might say, well, that's way out there. Come on. It actually isn't. Like, I've seen a lot of districts do this where they develop scheduling committees, and where nobody thought you could move the cheese of changing that schedule to get common planning time, they have. And again, then that really has helped as far as regular education, special education teachers being on not only the same page, but like teaching together in the same classroom. So that's inclusion. That's less pullout. You could argue that that's a movement toward less discrimination. So know about your CISA. Understand your CISA and what your CISA has to offer, and also know that you can approach your CISA and make a request and say, you know, this is something I'd like to see. One of the things I did as a director and worked with other directors, CISA typically has director meetings, well, we got together and said, okay, here's one thing we're really concerned about as directors. If we have a student move into our district who is hearing impaired and suddenly needs an interpreter, we need to be able to go to CISA, and either if CISA doesn't have an interpreter, have CISA work with us and try to find an interpreter. So that was for example, that was a concern that we had, that we approached with CISA. And then they went and they found interpreters and made sure that through their pool of interpreters that they could reassign, you know, if we had certain needs, that they could contact people and reassign them to us, or that they would be the employing agent, we could contract from them. One of the things that you want to be very aware of, I'm going to get my coffee back out. This is the second 24 ouncer, so I might be getting more hyper and faster speaking as these go on. But so make sure what your CISA, you know what your CISA has to offer, and typically too, you know, they have they have lending libraries for ELL. They have staff who are experts in that, especially for schools just kind of starting out with serving English language learners, that they can come in and help you get that set up. For special education, autism experts, behavioral. I tend to be at the model of I try to develop my own internal experts, so I would encourage you to do that as possible. But going back to that low incidence situation, if you have a student in your district that, let's say, might require some orientation and mobility services, or some services for being visually impaired or hearing impaired, it's best to try to go through CISA first on those services and do a contract. It's going to be expensive, there's no doubt about it. But if that student moves, then your contract with CISA terminates, versus if you have a contract with that person individually, it becomes much more difficult to terminate that contract. Probably not so much after Act 10, but it is much easier to do that contract through CISA and have CISA oversee that person. And but so that was one thing as a student services director that I always wanted to have in mind. And another thing is, be prepared if you have a student come in with high nursing needs. A number of students now have private duty nurses that are paid by Medicaid or through private insurance. They come to school with the student. So you'll want to make sure of a few things. One, that you have a background check on them, that you understand their role and responsibility, that they understand their role and responsibility when they're in the school. There, I would definitely say get your legal involved, and get a consult on what document agreement there should be. Because let's say the student has a private duty nurse, but the private duty nurse, there's a conflict in maybe what they're doing versus a practice that your nurse sees, as far as either a specific way to tube feed, or maybe there's just a concern, like this private duty nurse is on the cell phone all the time. You want to know the supervisor to go to for that person to be able to communicate. those needs. I've had to do that. I had to have people replaced because of things like that. And also, that's very tricky to negotiate. What is their role versus, what is your nurse's role? And sometimes a private duty nurse will want to help out and do some instructional activities, just because they're there. And you got to carefully weigh that out of, what you want them to do and what you don't. And also they're not teachers, but yet, if they're there, is there anything they can reinforce with the child, like during a time when they might be doing a tube feeding or something like that. Or I worked with a district recently that had a young boy with a trach. Very kind of complicated medical situation, but receptively strong child, like understood everything that was going on, start to use the augmentative communication system. But the nurse, private duty nurse, was trach trained. The district did not have a trach trained nurse, so needed to go through that process, needed to post in the community for sub nurses, needed to get those nurses trach trained, also needed to know that if a situation was in place where the nurse wasn't going to be available that day, that student wasn't going to come to school, and to work that out with the parents. Now, the school might have to provide compensatory ed, but you're not going to take trach care and make that a delegable nurse act, meaning a nurse can take a certain act, such as, office staff could administer, give medications, pills or something like that, as long as it's overseen by the nurse and the plan is put together. But the office staff isn't going to be using taking out a trach and suctioning a child or something like that. So you want to also make sure that if you have a situation, that you don't try to wing it. And as a pupil services director, there's going to be a lot of pressure from parents, always have the student in school. But if you don't have the staff to do that, and you're aggressively, trying to find the staff available to do that, for that amount of time, that child, probably needs to be at home. And then, you just have to understand you're going to be responsible for compensatory ed, or, if the parent's willing to have someone go to the home and the parent does trach care. I mean, these all get fuzzy, these situations, because I would feel more comfortable doing that than having a parent come to school, for example, and the parent say, okay, and the parent's not a nurse, but the parent says, I'll do any suctioning of the child while they're in the school if that needs to happen. No, don't do that. Again, that liability is on your shoulders, and mom is not a nurse, and even if she was a nurse, she's not employed by you, or maybe by another agency. In this case, she's just there with the child. So be very aware of the medical needs of kids in the nursing. And another, so we're talking about that. CISA doesn't, that's not a CISA thing. But when I talk about, low incidence, low incidence typically you're going to try to contract for. So even if it's like nursing for a student that comes in, are you going to hire a full-time nurse to be with a student, who has a trach and needs to be suctioned, potentially? Are you going to do that, through a regular school contract? Are you going to do that through a third party and try to contract that service? Because what if that student moves? These are decisions that you have to make, and then that third party, might have other nurses that they might be bringing into the picture. You need to make sure that they're all past background checks and things like that, where if you have your own nurse, you get more control over that. So, but just be aware, because what I've seen is a few times, and I've experienced this personally, is one time I had a student move in who was largely had a significant visual impairment. So came in and needed a special magnifying device and a light box and some other things. And so it was like a 7th grader. So boom, just came in the district, and then also needed some orientation and mobility services and some VI instruction and some Braille. So, and I'm like, I don't have any of these people on staff. So I talked to the local CISA. CISA was able to help me out with VI, but they didn't have any orientation mobility people. So I needed to post like in the newspaper and or on the weekend site, but also in the newspaper. And I did find, and I called around to other directors, and I found an orientation mobility licensed person that I was just able to contract with individually to come in and work with the child. So, but you want to have those things ready to go before you need them. And the same thing kind of comes with English language learners. You know, if you have a referral for special education and the student, their family speaks, you know, whatever it is, you know, Russian or the language, and you don't have anyone that speaks that language, or you know that's the child's primary language at home, you know, you want to know where you can go to get answers and maybe get people. And it might take a while. I think like in the Madison School District, they have 130 languages that are spoken. So imagine, you know, that's your job to coordinate that. But and again, and these things might be choppy. So as a director, I mean, don't feel overwhelmed. But if you can work ahead, I always had kind of a Rolodex. I had notes taken. And we would talk about this at area director meetings and things like that, of like, you know, who are some people that you would go to for you know, evaluations for different languages, and you know, actually what I ended up doing with that 7th grade student is I contacted the district where the student came from, and they sold me the special equipment that they used with the child. So I was able to buy it, you know, at a discount, and it was stuff he was all familiar with. So yeah, it arrived in a few days, and boom, I had it. So, and after he left, I sold it to the district that he went to. So you have to be kind of careful. There's some things with purchasing with idea and reselling stuff, but I mean, again, you know, think about these things and have your kind of go-to network. But anytime it has to do with health, do not wing it. Make sure that you have everything in order, because it's better to have that child at home and maybe have a parent upset with you, and you're, you know, while you're trying to put your services in place and make sure everybody's trained, than to again have someone come in and not have the level of training necessary to really support that student to the level that they need because of how complex their medical condition is. I talk about, well, I work at Wisconsin School for the Blind and Visually Impaired, or at least as when this recording happens, that's where I'm working. But that's an interesting discussion, because you could argue that that is an inclusive setting, or that it's not an inclusive setting, because everybody's there. Everybody who's there as a child has a disability. I mean, but one of the things I had as a director, I really had a misconception of the Wisconsin School for the Blind. We had a few students, you know, who were visually impaired, completely blind, and we served them in district. We worked with CISA and, you know, trained a aide to learn to Braille, you know, which is not that hard. I actually learned to Braille, read and write in 5 weeks, but and then getting materials ahead of time, you know, to this person so I could have them Braille and things like that. And it worked out, and the family knew, you know, how to Braille and things like that. But I had a perception that the Wisconsin School for the Blind was very much an institution like you'd think of, very kind of sanitized, a sterile setting, and just, you know, that imagine kids going down there and living there, and, you know, that would be kind of a last case thing you wouldn't want to do. Well, after working there, that's not the case at all. I mean, so I think as a director, you owe it to yourself to, at some point, you know, either make a trip down to see, you know, you can see Delavan Wisconsin School for the Deaf, and you can see Wisconsin School for the Blind in Janesville in one trip. But it probably is worth your time to schedule that for one day to just go and to see both facilities, because at some point you're going to have students who will be, you're going to have a consideration of, will there be a placement at either facility? and you want to be educated and have a concept of what these places are like. So Wisconsin School for the Blind, for example, I mean, has dorms, indoor track, swimming pool, wonderful cafeteria, and it's really like a family setting, kind of like a two-year college campus. And the kids who are there really typically love it because they're there with peers with kind of similar needs. They build close relationships. Some students have other comorbid needs, cognitive needs. Other students are there and are attending part-time there, part-time at UW Rock. So there's really a range, but that's you really owe it to yourself to see that. And another thing that I never knew, so I would throw the brakes on whenever that would come up as a discussion for placement because I was never really that well educated as a director about that. The kids go home on the weekends, so on Friday, whether it be by plane or by a bus or van or car or whatever, kids go home. So if they live in Superior, they're getting flown up to Superior and they're getting picked up Sunday and brought back to the school. So they do get to be with their family. And as far as feeling like kids are going to be homesick and not have things to do, boy, oh boy, that is just not the case. Kids, there's there's a ton of things, and it's very family, and there aren't. I've yet to see a student who's come in, and there's typically like a 45-day trial, who then does not want to stay at the school. That typically they really make an argument of, please let me stay here. And there's so much specialized equipment and services, I mean, that it's really impossible to replicate that level at a district. I mean, of the cost of all of the assistive technology, for VI, and the specialists that are solely employed to do that, plus orientation mobility teachers, and the amount and frequency of services that students would get, in addition to having materials that are presented in Braille and so forth. So I don't know as much about Wisconsin School for the Deaf, but again, I want you to keep an open mind to both of those, and I encourage you as a director, to schedule that out one day and make that a road trip. So when you do the SWOT assignment for this week, you don't have to use that assignment that I have, that format, which is the 4 squares. You can do it where you have the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. However you want to do that, just make sure you have 8 strengths, 8 weaknesses, 8 opportunities, 8 threats, and your stakeholders. Because some people have gone in, they've tried to edit the PDF form and things like that, and get frustrated. So that's just a template to kind of give you the idea. And you can look online. I mean, there are hundreds of thousands, maybe SWOTs of education, different areas. But it is a really good tool to tackle globally some things, or else just take a SWOT and look at SWOT as far as our behavior programming or services for kids. And again, look at that through a lens of non-discrimination as you put that together. So, are we providing, as an opportunity, are we providing staff with, could we provide staff with more training on behavior intervention plans and on sensory or things like that? So then students, might have more time in the regular education setting versus being out of that setting. So that's all I have. Hey, short lecture, I guess about 30 minutes here. So, and I look forward to seeing you in week 4.